The only video women pray you never find. Socrates, have you ever felt absence as a silence so heavy it seems to fill all the space around you? It's not just the lack of words, but a dense, almost palpable emptiness that corrodes the soul in silence. It is the invisible pain that grows when the other disappears, not with a shout, but with a vanishing that wounds deeper than any confrontation. This silent wound, which he never saw, is the shadow that accompanies those who wait in the dark, praying not to have to encounter what destroys from within. Seneca already warned us that what is not spoken corrodes from within, and it is in this silent corrosion that we often dwell. The emptiness of indifference settles like a cold wind that passes through the windows of an empty house, leaving an icy trail where there was once warmth. It is a wound that does not bleed visibly, but that bleeds in every averted glance, in every unsaid word, in every gesture that does not arrive. Silence becomes an abyss where the heart gets lost, and waiting turns into an anxiety that has no name. Epictetus, in his wisdom, reminds us that we cannot control what is outside of our domain, but we can choose where to plant our feet. Still, how many times does the heart insist on controlling the impossible, on clinging to what slips away like fine sand through the fingers? Waiting for someone who disappears is like trying to hold the wind, an effort that wounds and tires, that wears down the soul without us realizing it. It is in this waiting that silent anxiety is born, an invisible prison made of desires and pains that cannot be shared. There is a shadow deeper than physical abandonment, emotional abandonment. When love is reduced to crumb, when what remains is an empty echo inside the chest, the heart begins to pray for something it should not desire, for the presence that never arrived, for the attention that was never given, for the reciprocity that never exists. This absence weighs more than a scream, because screams can be heard, while the silence of abandonment is a constant whisper that corrodes the soul like rust on iron. It's a cruel paradox to wish not to encounter that hidden pain, that wound that is not seen, but that devours from within. Because true presence is rare, precious, and it is not found in crumbs or shadow. To wish never to cross paths with this emptiness is a silent prayer that many women make, even if no one knows. And it is in this wish that a journey begins, an intimate crossing that is not in the control of the other person, but in the courage to recognize one's own suffering and slowly to rebuild oneself from the ashes left by the silence. When silence becomes the loudest voice, when absence is the noise that fills every instant, the invitation is to look inward and understand that even in abandonment, there is a space where the soul can plant its feet, can find solid ground, where the wind of indifference cannot reach. Marcus Aurelius reminds us, the soul is strengthened by freeing itself from what does not belong to. Freeing oneself from the weight of the other, from the desire for a love that never arrived, is the first step to rediscovering the peace that lives within each one, even when the world outside seems to dissolve into empty. To love and be forgotten in silence is a wound that has no name, which weighs like a stone in the chest, invisible to the eyes of those who do not want. It is the exhaustion of giving your all and feeling that everything you offer slips through your finger like water that insists on not being held. This silent giving, so intense and vulnerable, often finds no response, and the emptiness that remains is not translated into screams or confrontations, but into an absence that cuts through the soul, a silence that speaks louder than any word. The rejection that is dressed as independent is even more painful. It presents itself as a gesture of strength, a clear refusal, but behind it hides a deep cut, a denial that leaves no room for grief, for the recognition of loss. It's like standing before a closed door without even the sound of a key turning in the lock. This silence of rejection is a slow poison that contaminates the day, the memory, and even the very capacity to love. Because what hurts is not just being rejected, but being forgotten in the midst of the noise of the world. Even in the middle of a crowd, loneliness can be an immense shadow, a constant presence that settles in the body and mind. It is the feeling of being invisible, of not being seen or heard, as if you were in a room full of people, but walking alone in the dark. This loneliness is a cruel paradox, where company, is not enough, because what is missing is true present, the gaze that recognizes, the gesture that embraces. It is a thirst that is not quenched, a lack that cannot be explained, an absence that is not filled. Giving water to a dry river and expecting it to overflow for you is an image that reveals the depth of this suffering, the effort, the hope, the giving. Everything seems like a useless gesture in the face of an emptiness that does not respond, does not move, does not bear fruit. It is a silent struggle, made of desires that do not find space to grow, of dreams that dissolve like mist in the sun. The pain of loving someone who is not available for love is an internal battle that consumes, that wears down, that leaves invisible but eternal mark. This corroding emptiness is not a weakness, but a reflection of the intensity of what was offered and not received. It is an invitation to look inward, to recognize that this pain exists, that it is legitimate, and that it does not need to be hidden. Seneca said that anger is a fire. It can warm or burn. Likewise, silence can be a shelter or a prison. The wound of silence should not be ignored. It deserves to be seen, felt, embraced, so that perhaps can one day stop hurting so much and be transformed into strength. Trying to save someone who never wanted to be saved is an invisible and painful path where giving becomes a prison and hope, a chain that binds without freedom. It is a repeated movement, a silent dance in which you offer the best of yourself, even when the other person is not present to reciprocate. This unconscious repetition of pattern creates a cycle that perpetuates itself, where the will to care for the other person becomes a weight that corrodes one's own essence. Emotional attachment, disguised as hope, is a shadow that settles in the heart. It confuses the desire to be useful with the need to be recognized, the will to love with the fear of loneliness. In this emotional labyrinth, freedom is lost, and what remains is a painful self-deception, insisting on a love that does not know how to take care of itself. It's like trying to feed a tree with severed roots, hoping it will flourish. This illusion, although silent, is as real as the pain it causes. Seneca reminded us that no one is a slave unless by their own will. This phrase echoes as a call to the silent responsibility we have for our own choices, even when they seem involuntary. The love that imprisons is not love, but a shadow that feeds on fear and lack. Recognizing this is not an act of weakness, but the first step towards inner freedom. It is looking inward and realizing that the deepest prison is in giving without reciprocity, in the attachment that suffocates. This invisible cycle is an internal battle where the heart oscillates between hope and despair, between wanting to save and getting lost. It is a paradox where one fights to keep alive something that deep down is already gone. Strength is not in trying to change the other person, but in recognizing where our domain ends and where the silence we must accept begins. The truth of attachment is revealed in the pain of empty waiting, and only in the silence of that pain can the courage to break free be born. The weight of absence can be a silence so dense that it seems impossible to bear, a shadow that grows slowly, almost invisibly, until it dominates every corner of the heart. This silent rupture does not explode in shouts, does not manifest in noisy confrontations, but in a profound exhaustion that infiltrates like a heavy fog, enveloping the soul and making the world around it gray and distant. It is the decision that is born in silence, when the prayer changes from a plea to wanting him to appear, to wishing he never appears again. This transformation is a delicate and painful threshold. It is not an abandonment out of weakness, but a firm recognition of one's own dignity. It is the moment when you understand that true strength is not in enduring everything, in carrying the weight of absence alone, but in knowing when to let go, when to allow silence to take the place of emptiness, not to suffocate, but to liberate. Marcus Aurelius teaches us the soul is strengthened by freeing itself from what does not belong to it. This lesson is a lighthouse in the dark, an invitation to abandon the burdens that make us fall and find the lightness of a soul that refuses to be captive. When expectation breaks, when hope runs out, the possibility of reconstruction arises. It is not about denying the pain, but about accepting it as part of the path, as a fire that purifies and transforms. The weight of absence ceases to be a sentence and becomes a starting point, an opening for something new to be born, even if slowly, even if with silent step. The moment of wishing he never appears again is, paradoxically, the instant when the soul rediscovers its own voice and begins to walk out of the darkness. This silent rupture is, above all, an act of discreet courage, an internal revolution that does not need an audience. It happens in the silence of the dark room, in the loneliness that was not chosen, but is accepted. It is the victory of one who understands that absence can be an invitation to the most important presence, the presence with oneself. And it is in this space that the heart learns, little by little, not to pray anymore for someone who was never there, but to rediscover itself whole despite the empty. Silence can be a sacred space, a ritual of reconstruction that is born from the absence and the emptiness left behind. It is in this place that the lost voice is found, the tenuous thread that connects the heart to its own essence. Refusing emotional crumbs is an act of self-care, a silent gesture that seals the beginning of a new story. In the abandonment of the leftovers, there is a hidden strength, a spark that waits to be fed by one's own virtue, by the internal discipline that only Stoicism knows how to teach. Writing a journal then becomes a faithful confidant, a space where words flow without fear or judgment. There, thoughts are organized, emotions find a way to express themselves, and pain is transformed into understanding. It is a simple but powerful practice that creates a bridge between inner silence and the external world, allowing the heart to be heard without haste, without pressure. Writing is an act of freedom. It is allowing the internal fire to turn into light, the storm to become a breeze. When days become storms, anchoring oneself in virtue is an exercise that strengthens the soul. It is not about reacting impulsively to what happened, but about cultivating the self-control that is born from the deep understanding that it is not events that disturb us, but the judgment we make of. Epictetus whispers this truth. It is not events that disturb us, but our judgment about them. This practice does not eliminate pain, but transforms the relationship with it, opening a space where serene presence can blossom even in the most adverse conditions. The silence that heals is an invisible armor, a refuge where the spirit finds rest. It is there that the soul, wounded but not destroyed, begins to weave its own rebirth. Reconstruction is not a grandiose act, but a succession of small moments, delicate gestures of self-love that reaffirm dignity and the courage to move forward. In the ritual of silence, one finds the true voice, the one that does not depend on the presence of another to exist, that grounds itself in virtue and quiet. Accepting absence is not a gesture of weakness, but a profound decision, an invitation to rediscover oneself in the midst of the emptiness that seems threatened. It is not the loss that defines the experience, but the way one embraces what remains when everything is gone. Seneca reminds us that not all loss is absent. Sometimes it is the freedom that is born to be reborn, to be rebuilt from what was torn away. This freedom, although silent, is a breath of hope in a tired heart. True peace arises from presence with oneself, from the quietness that sets in when the desire for someone who never made themselves present loses its power. It is a silent conquest, a state where the heart no longer prays for presences that were only shadows, but finds its footing in the solidity of its own being. Marcus Aurelius offers us this teaching. Live as if you have already left everything behind, and in the silence of that, you will find your true self. This is the voice that echoes within those who have learned to free themselves from the invisible chains of attachment and waiting. To imagine yourself as a lighthouse is to realize that strength is not in the ship that never docked, but in the constant light that remains lit, even in the densest darkness. The lighthouse does not depend on the sea, does not wait for the return of the wave. It is a firm presence, a point of reference for those who are lost. This metaphor is the last image that remains, to be the lighthouse that does not depend on the ship that never came, to be the strength that does not need another to exist. And in that silence, in the solidity of that internal light, lies true freedom, the reunion with oneself. You are not weak, you have just carried too much silence. This phrase could be a whisper to the exhausted hearts that walk in the dim light of emotional loneliness. The pain you feel is not a sign of weakness, but the legitimate weight of carrying an absence that was never filled, an emptiness that has become part of your body and mind. Courage often is the sound that silence makes when it decides to stay, when it decides to be heard without needing to shout. What hurts you points to where you need to plant your feet. This is a Stoic truth that challenges the common understanding of suffering. What seems like an unbearable weight is, in fact, a map, a guide to finding the roots that sustain the soul. It is in this recognition that the journey begins to transform pain into clarity, to make suffering a tool for strengthening and not for for destruction. Not all absence is loss. Sometimes it is space for you to fit. This paradox holds within it the essence of liberation. The absence that once seemed like an unbearable void can be transformed into a sacred space, a fertile ground where one's own identity can grow, flourish, and assert itself. It is not a matter of forgetting or denying, but of embracing what has been lost and creating a new meaning, a new shelter for the soul that seeks to be whole. To respond is power. To react is to give back power. This distinction is an invitation for strength to come from self-control and not from impulsivity. Conscious silence, an attentive inner gaze, the deliberate choice not to be consumed by what is not in your domain. These are the weapons of the Spirit. Power resides in planting your feet in what really matters, in presence, in clarity, even when the world around you seems to collapse in the silence of absence. When was the last time you listened to the silence within yourself? Not that superficial silence that fills the void with noise, but the deep, almost sacred silence, where the heart speaks without word and the mind quiets down to listen. This silence is the space where true courage resides, where pain can be embraced and not denied, where the soul finds its most authentic voice. It doesn't demand haste. It doesn't ask for a quick solution. It simply is, waiting to be heard. Before you go to sleep, write down the sentence you never dared to say out loud. Let the words free themselves from the weight they carry within your chest. Writing is an act of silent courage, an act of self-care that creates a safe space for the truth. Don't worry about the form or the meaning. Just allow what is trapped to find its way out. It is in this intimate moment that the heart begins to rebuild itself, piece by piece, word by word. For 90 seconds, sit with the anger, sadness, or fear, and allow it to reveal what it is protecting. This practice of presence is not to surrender to pain, but to understand it, to make silence a window into self-knowledge. When we can look at emotions without running away or reacting, we open a space for freedom. The freedom to choose where to plant your feet, as Epictetus taught, and to let go of what does not belong to us. If the wound were to speak now, what would it ask you to let go of? This question is not an invitation for easy answers, but for a sincere dive within yourself, an invitation for the silence that accompanies pain to become a bridge and not a prison. Because in the silence that embraces, in the silence that understands, the strength that transforms is born. It was just another cold morning, but something inside me already knew that everything was going to change. That silent emptiness, which I tried to ignore between tasks and routines, became a weight impossible to carry. It was not a scream nor an explosion, but a subtle fissure in the heart, like glass that shatters slowly until the pain becomes impossible to hide. This silent pain, invisible to others, echoed loudly within me, revealing a loneliness that cannot be explained. The sound of the heart beating in the dark of the room is the only witness to this internal struggle. Every beat is a reminder of what was lost, of what never arrived, of the absent presence that weighs more than any word, the waiting that has no end, the hope that slowly drains. All of this creates a shadow that drags through the mind, making it difficult to distinguish what is real from what is just a desperate desire for attention and affection. In the mirror, I see a face I no longer recognize, not because it has changed, but because it carries the invisible mark of silent rejection. It is the feeling of being present but not being seen, of speaking but not being heard, of loving but not being reciprocated. This wound that does not reveal itself, that hides behind a smile or a silence, is the true loneliness. And it is this pain that every woman prays never to find. For it is an invitation to a reunion with oneself, to a reconstruction from the ashes of emotional abandonment. What hurts you points to where you need to plant your feet. This is an ancient truth, but it remains as current as the wind that shapes the mountains over the century. Pain is not a punishment, nor a sign of weakness. It is a mirror that reveals the fragile root, the points where the soul needs to find firm ground to grow. When we feel the anguish of abandonment, the anxiety of waiting, or the loneliness in the middle of the crowd, these feelings indicate the place where we should seek our fort. The heart is a door. Sometimes it closes not to punish, but to protect. This locked door is a defense mechanism against repeated wound, an invisible barrier that prevents the pain from spreading even further. But within this protection, there is also an opportunity, the chance to learn to choose with whom to open this door, when to open it, and how to keep the key in our hand without giving it to someone who does not know how to respect our presence. Courage is the noise that silence makes when it decides to stay. It is not the noisy courage, the one that announces and shows off, but the silent courage, the one that remains firm in the middle of the internal storm, that faces loneliness, that remains whole despite abandonment. It is the strength that is born from acceptance, from the recognition of one's own pain, and that allows the heart to move forward, even when everything around it seems to collapse. This courage is not visible, but it is palpable in every gesture of self-care, in every choice of self-respect, in every step toward inner freedom.